Caleb Elcock, you're the first interview in the lounge room for the new year. Happy New Year to you, and thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm very well, and thanks for letting me be on to have a bit of a chat.
Mate, so glad to have you here. Today, we want to talk about God, belief, existence of God, whether it's reasonable to believe in those things as a young, groovy person, taking into account your personal experience and perspectives, of which you have very many interesting ones. You've already referred to it. You're born into a Baptist family. So maybe we go back to ground zero, a little bit about your upbringing, your first experiences and interactions with religious themes, and then just start passing that ball around into how that developed into your ideas as they pertain to belief, God, the transcendent, etc., as they are now. So back at the beginning, Caleb Elcock.
Wow. All right, back at the beginning. Okay, full disclosure, I'm not a Catholic. You know.
Yes, but that's a conversation for another time.
But that's a broad, that's a discussion for another time. But I grew up in a Christian household, Bible-believing Christian household, Baptist at the time. So at an early age, we were taught Jesus loves you, and here are, we had the children's Bible, and we did all of these sort of things. Went to children's church at a local Baptist church we went to, and that was all very well and good. Got to hang out with our mates, that kind of thing. Went to a primary school, public school, and that's when I think we got introduced to other religious ideas with RE and all of that. So we had the religious education people come through. And one of my earliest memories of confusion there was precisely that. We were sitting in school, and it was time for RE, and we had Catholic people come through, like the Catholic group of religious educators come through, Anglican, and I think that was all it was back then. So we were sitting there, and the teacher comes in and said, "Oh, here's Father whatever and someone else to do the RE. So who's Catholic?" So a whole bunch of kids put their hands up. It's like, all right, you get to go with Father whatever it is. So off you go with him, and he'll teach you all what you need to know. And so who's Anglican? And so a bunch of the Anglican or Church of England people put up their hand, and they went off with there. It's like, okay, so the rest of you are all atheists, so you get to stay here. I was like, oh, hang on a minute, I'm not an atheist. It's like, I'm a Christian too. I said, well, so are you Catholic or are you Church of England? I said, well, I'm kind of like neither. Like, we're Baptist. It's like, oh, okay. So where do you go? And so, well, we go to church. I was like, no, but which one of those do you go to? Do you go to the Catholics or do you go to the Church of England? I was like, I don't know. I'm just a kid. Like, you're the teacher. Make that decision for me, kind of thing. And so she spoke to the Catholic father and said, are these part of you? Like, are these part of your guys? And he turned around and said, no, they're not Catholic. They're a Protestant group. They do their own. They have their own church stuff. And he rustled into his bag and he pulled out some snacks, little candy bar things. It's like, but they can have these from the Catholic Church, and maybe.
What a good fella.
And I was like, oh, cool, man, this guy rocks, But I don't think it would be appropriate that they came to the Catholic Church RE class because they're not Catholic. I was like, oh, okay. What about the Anglican guy? And he goes like, no, they're Baptist, so they can learn by themselves in the class. So I was like, oh, okay. So they went off, and here I was sitting there amongst the atheist kids, and there was one Jewish kid as well there. And I was like, why aren't you hanging out with the atheists, and why aren't you going to there? And he said, oh, well, I'm not a Christian, and I'm a Jew. I said, okay, so what does that mean? And he's like, oh, well, we basically have your Bible, but the first half. And I was like, okay. So I became friends with him. And that's how, we had that whole mix of religious stuff there. And it's like, oh, that's interesting. We have all these different people here claiming their right over this God fellow. And we had separation of at least 2 or 3 Christian groups who say, we have God and we have Jesus, and then these guys say we have God and Jesus is how we do things, but none of the 3 shall meet, it seems, Baptist, Anglicans, or the Catholics, it seems. So that's
just
when
a
I
quick
thought
on that the fluidity of different ideas. That's so interesting, because I went to a non-denominational school, so there was never any religious education. But fast forward to university, and I think the first time where I really felt something like that was I took a few philosophy courses, and you sort of had 2 different groups of people. The people that loved the philosophy courses because it was really just intellectually stimulating. You got this diversity of ideas that you could play with and talk about and argue about, but really a very mamby-pamby approach. The other half being insanely frustrated, sort of like I was, even though I think I didn't air this. Actually, maybe I did. The patheticness of refusing to acknowledge that every single idea canvassed was mutually exclusive with every other idea. And it's this very liberal approach to ideas in terms of it's, the way it would have been described, or I think the way it was described, is these are all different tools that we present before you, and you go through and you take your tools and you apply them to get through life. And I go, well, that's all really interesting. But Kant and Aquinas and Augustine and Descartes and Hume, they didn't agree. So just truth claims and the different way, and I guess the really disingenuous way that I think that people interact with them. It's completely understandable, given that we live in a completely relativist age, but kind of irritating and dangerous.
It is, and that's those sort of ideas came to light very early on. Even that religious education experience. Well, it's like, okay, we have 3 Christian groups present in that school environment that don't seem to be seeing eye to eye here, and not really cooperate, not really jiving together. And that threw into question, because I was always taught, going to my church, that there is such a thing as there's an objective truth, right? And there is God's law and there's man's law. God's law is perfect. Man's law is inherently, there's problems with it. It's fallen because of sin and all that kind of stuff. And so then I thought, well, okay, if all those 3 groups that we're talking about were following God's law, how come there's 3 splits? And there's many, many more. I mean, you look at it now. I think I was reading somewhere there was something like 30 to 60,000 different Protestant denominations in the world today.
That's
a lot. That's a lot. And so I thought, and I've been thinking, well, somewhere along the line, there's a problem. We're all splitting, and there's no consistency. And if we're supposed to be the bride of Christ, for example, he's not into polygamy. There's only one. There's the church.
Yeah.
He's not into multiple wives and stuff like that. And so it was very confusing for me to have, well, even if you boil it down to a simple, there's Catholic and Protestants. Well, you still got 2, not one bride, and how does that work? But anyway, so
talk to me just briefly about being a Baptist.
Yeah. About being in what regard?
So just some core tenets, your experiences, and your thoughts. I mean, my understanding is you no longer practice as a Baptist. So
that's correct.
Essentially, just a little bit of a storyline and What about
Okay,
it
so
makes it no longer appealing to you?
Baptists are part of a Protestant arm that broke away from the Catholic Church, and through Calvin, and that's where they drew. This is where the Baptists draw a lot of their teachings from. There are two main sections or sects of the Baptists, and they're either going to be Reformed or Arminian. So Reformed follow Calvin's teachings big time, and they differ from the Arminians in that we don't have free will's a difficult thing to have the ability to make a free will choice per se to follow Christ, right? Whereas the Arminians take it differently and say, yeah, we are fallen and everything, but we do have a free will to choose Christ freely, and that Christ isn't actually empowering us in a certain way to choose him. So there's no such thing as a pre-elect in that way. It's more of the offer of salvation and the acceptance of Christ is open to everybody, and you're free to choose it freely, if that sort of makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So there are those differences. And I went to a Baptist church which was more Arminian in nature thinking. So it was more, yes, we have the free will, we are fallen, but we're not absolutely deprived of any sort of moral compass. We still have that, but we do need Jesus to fulfill and restore us to right standing with God the Father. So that's how that sort of worked. The church service that I went to was conservative in nature, in that they didn't have electrical guitars and things like that for a while, because certain oversight thought that they were tools of the devil, summoning up sort of demons and whatever else, because that's what AC/DC and all of that used to, Satan worship. So we don't do that. We use acoustic guitars and vocals. And then that sort of changed later on, where there was an electric bass, and then there was a drum set and stuff like that. So it was conservative in that way. And they were very strict as far as respect and everything like that is concerned, but they usually did hold to similar creeds, I believe, that the Catholic Church would do. So the Trinity, for example, communion in a sense, like we did have communion, but it wasn't to that level of transubstantiation and stuff like that. It was more of a symbolized sacrament sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's how that worked. So it wasn't super formal. It was more casual, a bunch of hippie dudes in a way, singing with guitars and reading Bible verses, a lot out of context, but that's what they did. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, you may have just alluded to it, but what was it about it that sort of undermined your belief in that way of life?
Well, where I parted from the Baptist church wasn't necessarily because of Baptist per se, but it was because the church that we were going to didn't have any of my friends there left. A lot of them left, and then I wasn't there with anyone in my age group. It was more 80-year-olds, and then there was just me and my brothers. So we didn't really have anyone to hang around with and, kick around a football or whatever. It was just us and then a bunch of old people. So at that point I was like, Mum, this is boring as. I need to go somewhere where there's a lot of people my age so we can sort of interact and be on that level. So she was cool with that. And so I ended up going to the high school I was going to was a Christian high school, but it was more a charismatic Pentecostal one. So the whole happy clappy, jumping around, speaking in tongues, moves of the Spirit, that stuff, which absolutely freaked me out, because coming from a Baptist church who would stand up straight, sing some songs, read the occasional hymn. There was no such thing as speaking in tongues, spiritual movements. It was freaky, seeing people convulsing on the floor and making crazy utterances and things like that. So, but I put that aside because I was there with my mates, and I thought, yeah, whatever, I can handle the freakiness, the weird spiritually stuff. As long as I was with my mates, I'll be perfectly fine. So I moved into
can I ask you a couple of questions? Ask you a couple of questions at this joint.
Stop me at any time you like. Yeah,
I will. So putting aside tradition, observances, customs you were brought up with, the new customs that you had to come to terms with, etc., what was going on inside your head? So as a young person, ideas of God, belief in God, supernatural, didn't phase you, came naturally to you. You're quite a you look at life at least as far as I've met you through a very, very critical lens. Is that something you developed over time, or from ground zero, you've always been quite analytical?
I've always been analytical, but I have experienced certain things in life, if you would call, say, miraculous or beyond the ability for the human mind to explain in natural terms, right? Even at that age. So there are things that have happened, and I was like, okay, I can't explain that through my rational mind. That was weird. Therefore, it's fine. It didn't faze me because it was just like, oh well, absolutely God can do these things. Why would I question that? Done. It's fine. Not a problem. When moving into this newer church, right? They were further on that spiritual spectrum than the Baptists were, absolutely. So when they were doing things like prophesying or speaking in tongues or doing that sort of a thing, that's when I started to get a bit more skeptical, because we would have people say prophecies and things, but they wouldn't come to pass. So there was a problem there. So I was seeking more in-depth theological content. And so I started hanging out with these Messianic Jews, which are basically hardcore into the scripture with a Jewish Jesus sort of flavor to it. And that was awesome. So I said, I can straddle those two. I can have my cool, hang out with my friends and stuff at the charismatic Pentecostal church, and then get the Bible stuff with the Jew dudes over here. That's cool.
Where did you meet the Jew dudes?
The Jew dudes was when I was about 23. Yeah, about 23. And that came about from a long story, but I met them, and that was really cool, because that's where I got the notion that everything all links from the Old Testament into the New, and everything's all fulfilled and everything's great. And if we mine this information in the Old Testament and we can mine it from the New Testament, it's very awesome and great. So I had this Messianic rabbi, and he was very knowledgeable and awesome and cool. But at the same time, I was with these charismatic people. So one day at this Pentecostal charismatic church, some lady came up to me and she prophesied this thing, and I was like, okay. She said, I'm getting from the Lord that you're going to go and marry this person. And I was like, what?
She's putting herself out there. I mean, that's a high risk.
Yeah, she's
prophecy.
And she's like, thus saith the Lord, you two are supposed to be together and get married, and you'll have a wonderful life.
So this is genuine. Is there like a formula to delivering a prophecy as well? Thus saith the Lord, you're going to win big.
Sometimes they say it exactly like that, and sometimes they'll just say, I'm getting from the Lord this, that, the other. But she went full out like that. And I was a little freaked out, to be
I don't mean to laugh.
Because
that's fascinating. I've never experienced anything.
No. Laugh, do whatever. It's a natural response. And I said, well, cool. But this particular lady that she mentioned, I I actually didn't really notice her much at all. Like I wasn't even interested in her at all. You know,
Yeah.
we weren't friends. We weren't talking really. I knew she went to the church and stuff, but as far as that's concerned, there was no sort of romantic interest at all. And I thought,
Uh-huh.
well, that's weird because to me, there's no feelings there at all, right? So, God does work in mysterious ways, sure, but I don't really see that happening, But
Yeah.
I freaked out because it's like, if it's a prophecy, then that's from God. And if you're saying, "Thus saith the Lord," then God's word comes to pass. It never, whatever he says will happen, happens. If he says something and it doesn't happen, well, it doesn't work like that. So if a prophet says, if someone comes and prophesies and says, "Thus saith the Lord," at 1, 2, 3, and you get an ABC instead of a 1, 2, 3, then that's what do we make of that? That obviously means that person is.
Didn't say the Lord, or
it wasn't from the Lord, right?
Yeah.
But I was like freaking out.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was total farce. And so I was freaked out, and I lost a bit of sleep over that. And I said, "Nah, this is doing my head in." So I went to the rabbi. I said, "Rabbi, look, I need some guidance here because look, this is what's happened. Some ladies prophesied that I'm going to get married to some other woman in the church there, and we, have a tremendous family, and et cetera, et cetera. What do you make of it?" So he laughed, just like, he was like, he's like, "Oh yeah, that's funny, very good." I said, "No, I'm serious. This is what was prophesied." And his face turned to one of concern and said, "Well, okay, right, we'll need to have a chat about this." So he sat me down and said, "Oh, okay, cool." So let me just tell you this. I'm not going to do the whole rabbi confusing, give you a parable to think about, go away and think about it, come back and ask you a question, and answer a question with a question. He said, "Look, here's the deal with these sort of prophecies. That's all very well and good, but until you hear a 'Thus saith the Lord' from God himself about this very matter in that exact same way, I wouldn't worry about it." That's probably, it's just something that would typically be left to your own convictions and not a prophecy like that. So then I said, okay, well, then it stands to reason whatever she said to me then isn't a prophecy, right? So, well, if it doesn't come to pass, it doesn't come to pass, therefore it's not prophecy. So, okay. Right. So I said, "Oh, we'll see what happens then." So several years went on, and
You
this
stand
particular,
around, making, throwing glances across the churchyard at
like, "Hey, Jesus said we should be married. Like, what's going on?" And no, none of that. I didn't do any of that.
Yeah.
I just kept doing what I would do, and I didn't change the way that I did things. And anyway, she ended up marrying someone else, and she's very happy with someone, and very good, great. But that means that prophecy is wrong at the end of the day. And I was saying, that's a big problem. You can't do that. And that's when I started to get a bit questiony in my approach with things, and said, well, how much of this whole church stuff is actually true then? If we have pastors and people of the congregation and all these various people doing prophecies and saying things on the pulpit, how much of this is actually true? Because at that time I was also hearing things from various pulpits where a church minister would say silly, weird things, that they would be caught in adultery, and they came up onto the pulpit and said, "Oh, well, I got in a vision that I had to divorce my wife and marry the secretary."
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay.
Those visions. Yeah.
Yep, that's some pretty interesting visions you've got there.
Those secretaries.
Yeah, and I started to whip out the Bible now a bit more because of my Messianic bros. And I said, yeah, that sort of doesn't line up. Like, God's not going to come down to you and say, divorce your wife and go out with the secretary because your wife is impeding your spiritual growth. That's not biblical, my friend. That's bad. That's naughty behavior, and you need to repent of that stuff. And so really start unearthing the realities behind all of this, because I have, on one hand, tremendous God experiences and connections here, but then I'm also seeing, on the other hand, God's people and the ones who are in power being extremely hypocritical in ways. So I'm like, how do I sort of make that all sort of work? And then at a similar time, I have one of my other brothers going off to another church where they denied the Trinity. And I was like, okay, so if they're saying that the Trinity is just made up stuff from the Catholic Church, I need to actually get to the bottom of what's true, where do we go from there, and how is it that certain core tenets of a Christian faith were informed. And that's what led me down the theological path of going to seminary for a bit, especially to suss out the Trinity, because I wanted to make sure that my brother wasn't in some sort of jeopardy, and that's where I went. And when I went to seminary and started to really unearth a lot of the finer points of Trinitarian thought, for example, it became very apparent that not everyone was on the same page from the get-go. And even looking through the church fathers, I was like, okay, so I started to strip back and go, right, if I was Baptist, why are we Baptist? All right, look at Calvin. All right, why did Calvin come to that sort of thought pattern? All right, Luther, go back. Luther, then church fathers, and for, back to the bare bones of gospel and Paul's letters. And then I go, well, how is it that he is saying the things that he's saying in these gospel letters and all of that? All right, he's basing it off these things. Is it valid? So that's where I'm went, and where I'm sort of still am at.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Yeah, because you did indicate, full disclosure, not that disclosure was needed, but it actually does help the conversation that you are not a Catholic, and you've got a diversity of experiences. You've studied church fathers, you've had dialogue with Jews, you were born a Baptist. And one thing that I think brings all that together, because in previous discussions you made the observation, and it's quite an obvious but interesting observation in terms of the main problem with Protestants is, well, where did your religion come from? And I was about to say most, but it's every single Protestant sect was born out of a predominantly political turmoil, dispute, etc. And that same question you've posed yourself about the Catholic Church in terms of contrasting that with Catholics, Jews being the custodians of the old law. Where does the Catholic Church claim its authority? And this is not the topic of today's conversation, but it's a very interesting one that can definitely be pursued at length another time. But the person of Jesus Christ, because last time you and I had a fascinating conversation. It was between you and me, and never shared. But it really brought to my mind what it actually means to believe in Jesus Christ. Because, of course, Catholics and a lot of Protestants probably take that for granted. But when you take away the person of Jesus Christ, nothing makes sense in terms of the new law. You place him in and you believe he is who he says he is, and everything takes formation. And off the back of that, I've looked into a few different books that I want to send you, etc. So it was a really interesting and beneficial conversation for me, because it really it's the pivot around which everything rotates. That person, Jesus Christ, which is just really interesting, but not exactly what I wanted to jump into. What I wanted to jump into was that's another long discussion. It's a massive long discussion. But ideas of God. Did you find it easy, being the analytical person you are, being a Baptist, you were disenchanted with what you saw from, being lied to about prophecies, etc., but you didn't run away from religion. And people have all different reactions when they feel betrayed, when they feel like, the wool's been pulled over their eyes and they have this revelation, oh my God, fancy believing that there's an old man sitting on a cloud, etc. Your thought process goes a little bit deeper than that. Why do you believe it's reasonable to believe in transcendence and ideas of God?
So during all that time, I started getting into a lot of the apologetic people from a Protestant perspective. So William Lane Craig, for example, was one key person. C.S. Lewis, a whole bunch of those people. Francis Schaeffer, for example, as well, and John Lennox. It was very good too.
On Lennox, I've seen him in action, and I'm very impressed. Yeah.
So he's very good. Even speakers like Dinesh D'Souza, who is a Catholic fellow, he is very good at putting forward the reasons, right? And then I even started looking at a lot of the atheistic apologists as well to see, what do they have to say about the whole situation. The issue is that I've come, like, boiling it down, setting aside what I've seen the men and women of do and behave, because we're all human and make mistakes and do stupid things, but we have to get outside of the human reflection of the church and get to the truth of it all. And that's always been my charge, is that I want God without the gimmicks. Okay.
I like that.
And
what do you mean by that? God without the gimmicks?
And so, so what I mean by that is I want to be able to boil down, first ascertain, like, is it reasonable for a person to believe in a divine transcendent being, God, let's say. And so we have to peel back all of those layers to the very beginning and say, why should one believe in God? What does that mean? What does it look like? Without God, what would that look like too? Because so I came at it from, well, if you look outside the window and you look at creation and stuff like that, so everything is all very much fine-tuned in a way that if we had a little bit more gravity or a little bit less oxygen and so on and so forth, we would cease to exist. So there's something there that would indicate there is a creator, a sort of a harmony, if you will, so that we can exist, humans, creation, and so forth. Sun, star, moon, all of that. Yeah, so it's about peeling back the layers of reasonableness, if you will, to why it would be logical to think or believe in a divine being, right? So there's the what's called, so I've got three key areas that I've looked into. So there's the teleological argument, which is the fine tuning of nature. So there's that. Now, like I said before, the specific right amount of oxygen, the way that the human body comes together and works in the way that it does, would be an indicator of a creator, or natural selection or evolution. Okay, that's a separate thing. So for me, natural selection doesn't really cut it. Evolution doesn't really cut it, because that would take an astronomical amount of time and chance to make that all happen together. Okay. Now, atheistic scientists, come at it from different angles, having various universes and parallel universes that, given enough, so I think is it string theory, something like that, given enough different universes at play, there will be enough chances to make the Earth that we live in happen. Okay, without a creator God. Okay, well, perhaps so, But then if you're applying Occam's razor, which is the more simplest explanation to make something happen, and then there's also there's like that cosmological argument, which is links to the teleological argument, where, well, if we hit the reverse button on the universe and we go back in time further and further, there's going to be a beginning point, right? So various scientific thoughts says, there's a big bang, a star blew up somewhere and then kicked off the whole creation process, like evolution, for example. It's like, okay, cool, but we'll have to stop you at that big bang, because what caused that big bang? Something has to come from something, Matter can't be created nor destroyed. Mm-hmm. So something has to exist outside of time and matter to cause matter and time to exist, if that sort of makes sense. Arguments surrounding how long did the Earth creation occur? If we're looking at the biblical narrative, the whole 6 days, was that 6 Earth 24-hour days, or 6 days at 1,000 years per day, or what? It doesn't really matter at this point. The fact is that something has had to have happened by something, right? Something has to come into existence with a creator. And the atheists will say, oh, well, if you have God, then who created God, right? Well, that's not really a big problem if he already just existed to begin with. He existed outside of this time-space zone, right? And even Tertullian spoke about that when he was trying to figure out what the Trinity was, and that, you have God outside of creation. He created everything, and whilst he is also outside, he's simultaneously interacting and part of it as well. But anyway, that's a different thing. So what I'm saying is that for those two reasons alone, the teleological and cosmological argument put forward good reasons as to why there would be a God to begin with. That doesn't dictate whether it's the Christian God, a Jewish or Muslim reflection of that, but it just says that there is an existence there outside of the human sort of experience, if you will, or what we're able to fathom.
Quick comment on that before I follow that up with a question. So you're referencing teleological and cosmological arguments. I think last time we spoke, you indicated you weren't all that familiar with the works of Aquinas, who really, correct me if I'm wrong there.
No, thank you. Right. Yep.
The OG of the teleological and the cosmological argument as we understand them in Christian Western thought, and he based his works very much off the works of Aristotle, drawing on original Western philosophy. But pretty much what I find so potent about his arguments and his style, I'd really recommend you having a look at them, because they hone in on philosophical realities as we have to understand them to exist for us to be able to exist. So a book, an author, Edward Feser, who comments an awful lot on those works, sort of made an observation with intelligent design arguments as obvious and as strong as they are. If you apply sort of rationality and Occam's razor, there's still that very small window for the smart ass atheist to go, well, there's still a chance. Whereas if you take basic philosophical propositions like existence, potency, actuality, and you break things down into those component parts and you go, that truly is, but it is potentially something else. And it can only become actually that other thing, which it potentially is, if it comes into contact with something which already actually is. He breaks things down into those sort of component parts and then creates these sequential chains that you go, you start looking at everything completely differently. And it's not a God that sets a ball down a hill and then lets it run out of control. He's actively, as you said, actively interfering with life to keep this chain of continual change operating.
Yep.
And Aquinas goes, in terms of what is God, you have to reduce that back to an unmoved mover, because you cannot have ad infinitum.
Precisely.
If it was ad infinitum, then nothing would be moving at all, because you've got this change of actualizing potencies, but everything is relying on a previous agent to have that interaction with. And if the atheist goes, well, it's got to go all the way back to infinite regression because that's just what it is, well, then you've got nothing, which is evidently impossible. False. We have something.
That's illogical. Yep.
But fascinating arguments. Really recommend you have a look at Aquinas's works and commentaries on Aquinas's works. I'd really recommend Edward Fee's up. But following on from what you said, what was it that made you seriously entertain the Christian / maybe even let's incorporate the Jewish tradition of who God is, the Abrahamic, Messianic ideas of God, as opposed to all the different weird and wonderful possibilities regarding the supernatural which are out there?
Yeah. So absolutely right. There's there's many cultures around the world. So through Europe and everything like that, you have the pagan gods, Vikings, and all that kind of good stuff. And throughout India, you've got Hinduism, pantheism, everything, right? So then what's true? Which is true? Who's making the same claim? And it's the same deal with, well, then you could say, oh, well, my religion has our priests or prophets or prophetess or whatever performing these fantastic miracles and signs and prophecies that come to pass and all this fantastic stuff. So therefore we have the claim to interacting with the divine. Okay. So, a lot of the Pentecostal charismatic folk will say, look at this. We pray and then someone is healed from a blood cancer, or we pray and da-da-da. So that means that our God is right and true. And say, okay. But these same sort of miraculous claims aren't exclusive to the Christian movement or the Jewish movement or whatever. They're also Muslims and stuff like that say the same thing. I worked with a Muslim colleague and he was like, oh yeah, my imam prayed for da-da-da, and then they were healed of a certain thing. And it's like, okay, cool. So we can't take the whole miracles and signs and wonders and stuff like that as the measure from which gives exclusive right to the divine being, right? Which is a problem, because that's where so many of these religious organizations draw from. So then I looked back and said, well, what do the Christian, like Protestants, have to say about all of this? Well, they know it's true because the Bible said, right? You have the Gospels, you have witnesses in the Gospels attesting to Jesus and like you were saying, the person of Christ and what he's all about and la, la, la. And so I was like, all right, cool. So they're pointing to the gospel texts as their point of authority. So we have to analyze whether or not that's legit or not. That's a separate thing. But what do the Jews have to say about all this? Because they don't have the gospels. Well, they have them, but they don't see them as an authoritative source, right? So what's their shtick? Why do they say the Torah, the Old Testament, is authoritative, that speaks to God as the one and only God? Because during their whole history, they were amongst a lot of pagan, multi-god sort of philosophies of the Greek and the Romans and all that kind of stuff as well. But they had a monotheistic view instead of many multiple gods running around doing things. So, well, what's their authority source? And when I was talking to these Orthodox Jews, it goes back to the Exodus. That's their point, where God comes down, delivers them from the hands of Egypt, their Egyptian oppressors and stuff like that, and most importantly is he reveals himself to the entire nation first. It says when they get to the mountain, they said, I'm God, the guy who brought you, I am the God, your God, who brought you out of Egypt. And so it wasn't a matter of 12 apostles or a few hundred people or a bunch of, like the Mormons would have it, Joseph Smith and a few family members as witness. It was an entire nation was witness to this. And their argument is that if it was an entire nation that witnessed all of this, surely if it was all fabrication or something made up, some smoke and mirrors behind the scenes with a special group or whatever, that would all sort of come out in the wash later on. But the fact is that continued as the generations went down. It was a personal transmission of, my father was there who saw all these things, and it was my grandfather was there who did all of these things, my great-great-grandfather. And so they trace their lineage back that way and say, this is why we believe that we have the right one God. And to me, that has a lot of stock in it, because when you start tracing back and other religions, and I haven't done too much in the terms of like Hinduism or whatever else, it's like, how can we rely on the testimony of the various clergy of these religious orders? And how can I tell what they're telling me is true? Is there a way that can I punch holes in it, right?
Yep.
And so for the Jewish one, it's very difficult to put those holes in it, because then you can match that up with historical landmarks and things of that nature. When it comes to, say, Mormonism, for example, they have narratives of tremendous battles occurring in the States. But when you do archaeological digs around that, not a sword can be found. All right, so there's problems there, But when you do the same thing for biblical events, you start to unearth things. I mean, archaeologically speaking, there are issues, for example, with Jericho and all of that some contemporary archaeologists have pointed forward, it's the wrong time zone or something. Yeah, okay, maybe we have the dating wrong or something, but the fact is that there is something there. It's better than you dig in that site and don't find a thing, right?
Yeah.
So that's where I've come to a point of I can accept, especially we're talking several thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
And,
huge, fascinating. You've done two things.
It's absolutely.
Yeah, oral tradition, and we live in a day that has zero respect for the very idea of tradition. Whereas if you think about where those things came from, and even the primitive way of communicating messages via oral tradition, I mean, writing as a way of keeping records, I don't want to say is young, but is not as old as man itself. For a very long period of time, the only way to maintain and pass on a message was that method of oral tradition. The literature's there. Go read it yourself if you're interested, people. But what a lot of people don't understand, and you can only understand this if you read the text, is that what that led to was this scrupulous safeguarding, which actually gives, within scope, certain oral traditions a very high degree of authenticity. And a lot of ancient scholars can attribute that to, or examples of that, biblical. There's a lot of, within the historic society, there is a lot of archaeologists, etc., who have a very high degree of respect for biblical narrative for that very reason. It is I think common consensus is quite authentic or problematic for people trying to rationalize it. Another thing is talking about, if you're going to believe something that's absolutely fantastic, like the idea that God appeared in a burning bush and gave directives to Moses to lead a race out of Egypt and the manna, etc., you've got to be able to believe it. So this idea of something miraculous occurring, to contrast that with, the Lord doth say, you're going to bring home that Ferrari tomorrow, pal. It's got to be believable. And I do think there are certain things that exist in the world that are beyond our comprehension and qualify as the big question marks. The Ferrari not being one of them. Explaining certain archaeological findings with biblical roots, definitely. But even some of more contemporary than just Old Testament. For example, I'm going to be doing a conference in the not too distant future with an expert on the Shroud of Turin. And that is a topic that still has a lot of people in, just scratching their heads, trying to explain something that, for all observations, really cannot be explained through a purely scientific lens, or the scientific answer that the experts reach is not one that they find particularly satisfying. And that points to that's the interesting thing, because this collective perspective on, God appearing at the top of Mount Sinai, very, very similar thought process that goes through to attributing the authenticity to the New Testament. That's what I found so interesting about the way you articulated it. I thought that was very, very good in terms of the strength of the oral tradition. And sure, the predominant source would be those 4 evangelists, the 12 apostles, etc. But digging down into it, and there is literature on this, which I will definitely share with you, talk about pretty much the authenticity of the original testimony, whether it's believable. And that is such a fascinating and powerful point to explore. But I want to ask you now a question on a slightly different point, because I think if you go to a party and you find somebody who's crazy enough to sit down with you and thrash out these ideas, and they might be, a stylish agnostic, or even more offensively an atheist, and you pass these balls around, and I think in the realm of the intellectual discussion, it's possible to have somebody not be able to respond to these points. Either they can't, beyond a reasonable doubt, disprove the logic of the philosophy, i.e. your teleological arguments, which based on reality as we know it, you can't really refute. Sure, there's a degree of faith in there in terms of what that actually means, but you can't really refute that regression to an unmoved mover. But what does that mean for a life choice? Because so many people would go, oh, yeah, you do it all the time. Do you believe in God? Oh, maybe. Yeah, I guess I do. I don't have a problem with God. Yet it means jack all for choices made in the personal life. What are your thoughts on that in terms of what the belief in the supernatural means for people as individuals?
Yeah, okay. So that then moves on to the third sort of line of reasoning, which would be the moral argument that I would put forward. So with that immovable mover, so once you've gotten to the point where, okay, so there is a God, all right, fine. And then we have to think, well, how does he reveal or respond or interact with his creation, or does he at all? So this is the issue that early on in the piece, I think he was a bishop, but he was kicked out. Marcion, if you ever heard of that guy, Marcion, he came at it like this. So back in the day, he was rocking around with people like Tertullian and Irenaeus, and so he had this idea that, well, we've got the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament's for the Jews and the New Testament for the Christians, because when I read through the Old Testament, it puts forward a God which is basically set up the world, and then it sort of failed him, and he didn't give a rip anymore, and then left it to its own devices. And then that's why you have, then Jesus came along in the New Testament and to fix everything up that this God the Father thing, deity made, and didn't take care of. And that was his idea. That's how he sort of reconciled the two parts of the Bible, if you will. He obviously didn't have all of the writings back then, but to his mind, it was just like, yeah, okay, so we've got this God who set something up, it didn't work out, and then we actually had another God, which is Jesus Christ, working in the background, who then revealed himself in the New Testament to fix everything that the original God, the Creator, did, who was sort of disenfranchised with the whole thing and left. So that sort of thought was in play then, and I think at the core of his thinking may have been, there has to be a God that interacts with the human or the creation, right? And that's what the New Testament reveals, according to him. Okay, so if we that sort of thinking is with a lot of people today, even it's just like, yeah, I believe in a God, but he's sort of like out there, doing his thing. He doesn't really interact, and it has no sort of bearing on what I do as a person today. But that's a problem, because what you're saying then is that whilst there is a God, the real God who sort of makes the real life decisions of how I carry myself in business, do I rip people off, do I pay tax properly, do I do all these kind of things, is actually up to my discretion. So I am the moral lawgiver of my own life, my own destiny, And, well, that may seem good, but if you've been on the planet for a little bit of time, you'll realize that whatever you do, you can land yourself in trouble. So if I think in my wisdom that I should be pulling a knife out of a toaster when it's plugged in, I'm going to get an electric shock. But to me, that may seem like the right thing to do at that time, because I don't have that knowledge about electricity, perhaps. So what I'm saying is that if everybody's left to their own devices, it's like a rudderless ship. I think that's in C.S. Lewis mentioned it like that. It's a bunch of ships floating around, and without a single point of reference, morally speaking, you'll all basically run rudderless ships, and you'll run into each other and cause damage, which is what we see today. So with the Christian thought, or let's say biblical thought, Old Testament or New Testament, it sets up the narrative that there is an objective moral reference point that you can align your moral compass to as a human and be on a straight and narrow and not sort of hit into everyone else. Okay, so it goes outside of, again, that human spectrum and experience. But even in a democratic society where we all get to have a say on what law gets passed and what gets done, there have been instances where a group of people, the majority even, have voted for something terrible, and that's come to pass as a law, and that's what has happened. So to me, the reality of the situation is that having a divine being that exists outside of our human experience sets up the framework for an objective moral standpoint, and the fact that this divine being is also present with us as well sets up the notion that he actively experiences life with us as well.
That's a really interesting way of putting something that is quite complicated. I think you did a great job of simplifying that. And I think the brilliance of God is, even though we can take him and shove him in the corner and advocate and espouse his non-existence, we still can't fight against our own nature. So we can't live a way that's compatible with pretending that he does not exist, because you look at, examples you and I have discussed previously: Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot,
the whole lot,
Tutsis and Hutus. If you reject the law of love, the Ten Commandments, Christian notions of charity, selflessness, and exchange those for allowing hatred, vice, selfish decision making,
Yep.
you end up with chaos. And sure, people can still come out on top, but it's going to be very few, and those few are going to have a very painful existence. The state of nature that I think it's Thomas Hobbes writes about, where life is, can't remember exactly the phrase he uses, but ugly, brutish, and short.
Yep.
And nobody actually wants that existence. Another example being, I think, free will. People can say, yeah, I've got, or refusing to acknowledge the existence of free will, which a lot of people do. You know, this is my destiny, I'm going to do this. And then you look at something like regret. How many people sit alone at night lamenting the fact that there was this actual pain and remorse they feel by virtue of the fact that there was another way that things could have been done, and they didn't do that. And these are just things that we all experience. They're realities. They're the basis upon which we exist every single day, from getting out of bed, from engaging in our duty of state, just things we all do that you're stupid not to acknowledge. Because if you acknowledge those, you are not acknowledging your own existence. And nobody does that.
Yep. Absolutely. It's unless you have a severe mental sort of psychological bent, like not psychological, a psychotic bent, then yes, those are those things that you will naturally feel, right? Empathy, sympathy, and all of this. I think perhaps one of the most striking points that's stayed with me when I've read some of these theologians, Francis Schaeffer is a contemporary theologian, and he said that the biggest issue facing humanity today and into the future is personal peace and apathy. So it's like, if I'm happy, then who cares about everything else? As long as I have my home or house or job or money, enough things to put on my, food to put on my table, there's your personal peace. And then the apathy part is like, as long as I'm not concerned, I see no evil, hear no evil kind of deal. So, there's millions of people dying in Africa from starvation and whatever. There's heaps of people getting incarcerated without adequate trial, etc. But who cares? Because it's not impacting me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a lot of what people sometimes get trapped into, that where it's like, all these things are going down. Yeah, it's terrible, but in reality, who cares? That's a problem. Like, for me, that's a problem. It's like, you should care. And that's what the God of the Bible has set forth. You do need to care about everybody. Why do you need to care about everybody? Well, it's rather simple. They're all image bearers of God. Humans are unlike animals in that they have been made with an image of God imprinted on them. So if you're not caring about other humans and stuff like that, well, you're ignoring basically these creations of God who reflect back that divine being,
Mm-hmm.
And so that elevates a need for looking after your neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself. So as much as you have this empathetic drive to have personal peace and everything, you need to go and seek that out. Seek a personal, like a peace to others as well. That's pretty simple. Love your neighbor as yourself. Oh, wow. Okay. Wow.
I think one of the most beautiful lines in the New Testament, and it's one that every time I read it, this may sound a bit cliche, but it is really, I think, a beautiful line that when you're in the darkest moments, it's the one you turn to. Come to me, all ye who labor and are burdened, and I will give you rest. And there's so much to unpack in that, because it's calling. It's beautiful in and of itself. If you come to me, I love you, I will relieve you, I will give you rest. That the idea of a God that loves its creations like that is just beautiful. But
it is amazing.
There's another element to that, and it's come to me. Follow my way. You turning in and becoming insular and trying to figure this out yourself is futile. Here are my laws. Here's the way of life prescribed by me. Here's the example of it working. Here's the consequences of if you ignore that. Come to me, seek the truth, find the truth, love the truth, and you will find rest. And I just think it's a summary of Christian theology. The consequences of following it are beautiful. The consequences of ignoring it are not so good.
So great.
Yeah.
No. Well, and that's precisely that's the thing that I found out with talking with Jews and Christians and everything like that. Well, they have the claim of an Old Testament and Christians Old Testament plus the New Testament, but the core of it is that even in the New Testament, Jesus, when he's approached, I think it's in Luke 18:18, where it says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And he said, well, you've been told, love the Lord with all your heart. What does it say? This is what you go and do that. And go and keep those laws. And then when you look at Psalm 119, which is all about how awesome it is when you keep the law, it's painfully obvious. It's just like when you surrender yourself and your own desires to keeping the laws, it's actually better for you than not, right? And within some of the Pentecostal charismatic Protestant arms, it's like, they would palm that off and say, oh, that's just legalism. That's too legalistic. That's just whatever. We don't do that. Everything's all fulfilled. So it's like, I don't think so. I mean, where in the Bible does it say that, especially Old Testament says there's going to be coming a time where you don't have to follow laws and rules. It's just about the vibe, man. It's like love and stuff, and that's it.
I think it actually says the truth will set you free, and I don't know how you
truth will set you free
in any other way than the truth.
A
truth will set you free.
Yeah, and the application of the truth will set you free. It's like the laws, and this is exactly what Jesus was saying. Is like the laws, go and do that. That's it. So he's not saying them, go and do something else. He's saying, you have to love the Lord with all your heart and soul and mind. So go and do it. How do you do it? You see what he says he wants you to do. Well, feed the poor, look after the widows, be compassionate, stand up for truth and justice, set up fair courts and systems. It's all throughout there, and that's what we should be doing. It doesn't matter if you're a Christian or a Jew or whatever. Those are the same laws, and you're exhorted to go and do these things, justice, fairness, all that stuff. So that's why, that's why I ascribe to those tenets, if you will.
Huge.
Because without it, I'm just going to be a selfish person and be like, hey man, I'm going to make millions and billions and trillions, and then sit in an ivory tower and eat, I don't know, chocolate eclairs all day, and don't give a rip about everyone else, and I will be awesome, and I'll feel great. But I think that's a lie. I think that is, like you alluded to, you have all these people who feel bad for stuff that they've done, and I think it's the same. If you're a multi-billionaire, even though you have all the money in the world, I don't think it's going to satisfy you if you're living an immoral life.
Agreed.
And that's why you need a moral giver, which is outside of the human.
Yep. It's just the way we are, isn't it funny? Just the way we are. We're not any other way.
Simple as that.
Way. Yeah. What a discussion. Thoroughly enjoyed that. And I'm going to invite people actually. So you're currently on this inquiry, more or less, where you are trying to apply this really forensic lens to, the question of what is truth. You're not the first person to ask it. You're not the last person to ask it. Yeah,
I won't be the last. Yep.
Picking up every single stone you can find and you're reading it, which is really admirable. I'm going to invite people to, whether in the comments or contacting me, to pass on to you literature that goes to questions of, Catholicism, discrepancies between Catholicism and Judaism. But fingers crossed there will be people. But I really thank you for joining me. Thoroughly loved having this conversation. There will be many, many more, I assure you. But apart from any comments you may have, really appreciate you joining me.
Oh, that'd be great. I mean, if you have any sort of epic theologians from a Catholic perspective, like texts and stuff like that, be interested to read, particularly surrounding how it is that they become the new holders of truth, let's say. That would be good.
Yep.
Like, where's that link between the Old Testament and the New Testament connected, and say, here it is and here it is, and this is, if the Christian is the one to take up that the banner or whatever, then there needs to be a link there somewhere, and that's what I'm trying to find.
That link is Jesus Christ, but it's what that means. It's unpacking that, and
that's what that means. So if you have texts that point to it in a big and solid way, that would be very much appreciated.
100%. We'll get on the case, and also have a look at Aquinas, because there's enough literature written by him that would keep you, I think, probably snowed under for the rest of your life. So he's not a bad place to start. But to wind this all up, thank you so much for joining me. Really looking forward to our next conversation. It's been riveting, and really looking forward to what people have to contribute to help you on this journey you're undertaking. So, Caleb,
awesome.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Cheers.